Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. As usual, if you aren't already subscribed, please consider doing so. I would greatly appreciate it. And also, if you have any questions regarding this specific tutorial, feel free to leave them down in the comment section down below. And if there's anything you guys want to see in the future, also feel free to let me know and I'll work on making those videos. So let's jump into it. In the previous tutorial, we kind of went over custom controllers and how that's differentiated from standard controllers and standard list controllers. And I think for today, kind of to start to wrap up this basic Visualforce tutorial series, I'm going to go over controller extensions. So let's jump into our VS Code and kind of do some examples on that. So in our VS Code, before I start talking about what a controller extension is, I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new Visualforce page. So I'm going to just open up the command palette and I'll hit the create Visualforce page. And this one I will call it Visualforce controller extension. And again, I just create these different pages. That way we can kind of organize ourselves and see the different videos or the different pieces of code I've done in case I need to reference them in the past. Not really necessary for this, but anyways, after we run the command, we get a sample template Visualforce page, which is fine. And for today, because of the nature of controller extensions, I'm going to go ahead and go into, I believe, our first ever Visualforce tutorial that we did regarding controllers and stuff. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of copy this, and I'll explain why in a second. So copy paste here, save that real quick. And yeah, let's jump into it. So a controller extension is essentially a way of more or less extending the functionality of the main controller that you might have in your Visualforce page. And what I mean by that, in this specific example, this Visualforce page, we already have a standard controller defined. Now, if there was some additional functionality that you need to have, but that your standard controller didn't provide, then the controller extension might be a good candidate for that. So as you might be aware, if you've watched the previous videos or you have some knowledge about controllers and controller extensions, the standard controller has some pretty nifty functionality built in, right? Like it allows us to save, to do a quick save, to do an edit, to delete records, all without us having to write any code at all. Like that's just standard Salesforce functionality built into the standard controller. But let's say we wanted to have some logic to basically have some custom validation or custom inserting of records based on, very nuanced like business logic that you might have. If your implementation requires anything like that, but you still need to use the logic from, like, let's say the standard controller, which is our account in this case, or even if you're referencing a custom controller, then consider using a controller extension. And like I just said a second ago, a controller extension can be used to essentially extend the functionality of either a standard controller or a custom controller. Essentially, it's like you want to leverage the built-in functionality of whatever controller you're referencing, but you want to either override any functionality that's in the standard controller or custom controller, or you want to add additional functionality. So I hope that kind of makes sense. But there are some things to kind of keep in mind. Like I mentioned in my previous video with the custom controllers, that runs in system mode, and that standard controllers run like in a more user mode where it will respect permissions and field level security and sharing rules of whatever users on the page. The controller extension itself will still run in system mode. But here's the interesting part. If your main controller, which in this case would be the standard controller, if you're using a standard controller but you're still extending a custom controller, well, the standard controller itself will still run in like a user mode where, like I said, it does respect permissions and field level security and sharing rules, but the extension itself will run in like a system mode itself. So it's kind of interesting how those permissions and rules work. And like I said, I'll probably make a video in the future going much more in depth into this. This is just like a very general overview. But yeah, so that's hopefully that little description of what controller extensions are makes sense to you guys. If not, feel free to leave questions down below and I'll do my best to answer them. But anyways, so for today's video, like I said earlier, I kind of just copied our first ever standard controller tutorial that we did, And we're basically just going to extend this standard controller with our own custom controller. And I think what I'm going to do is we'll do a few things. We'll extend our controller with our own custom controller, and then we'll add our own logic to it. And maybe we'll make like a method that like auto populates some fields for us if we're feeling too lazy to do that ourselves, just so you can kind of see how the controller extension works. And then at the end, I will also show some kind of nuances when it comes to having multiple controller extensions, because that's definitely a thing. So yeah, let's get into it. So to define a controller extension, we can use the extensions attribute in the page tag right here. And inside of here, we basically just define the name of our Apex class. So I'm going to go ahead and create an Apex class very quickly. And we'll just call this Visualforce controller extension. The name doesn't really matter much here. And we'll just drop it in the default directory. And like I mentioned in my previous video about this with sharing keyword, I will go more into depth with it. I don't really feel like rehashing it, what I said in the previous video, but yeah, anyways. So getting rid of that for now and kind of just ignoring what that means. And once we have that, let's go back into our Visualforce page and just kind of paste the name right here. So with that now, we have essentially extended the functionality of the standard controller with whatever logic is in here. And well, we don't actually have any logic in our Visualforce controller extension yet. So let's go ahead and do some stuff in here. So in order to actually make this a controller extension, we need to do one thing, which is kind of important. In the constructor right here, we should expect to have some arguments, or one argument rather. And that is basically the standard controller functionality. In this case, because our main controller in the Visualforce page is a standard controller, that's why I keep saying that. We're going to basically expect to receive the context or the standard controller in our controller extension. So in order to do that, we will say Apex, or Apex pages rather, dot standard controller, if I can type. And then we can give that a name. So we'll just say std controller, like so. And once we have this right here, this reference to our standard controller, we can do some other cool things. So as an example, if we have a controller extension, we probably want to have some way to manipulate the records that are in our Visualforce page. And in this case, we are working with an account record, right? So we need some way of accessing the account record in our Visualforce controller extension class. And an easy way of doing that, so I'm going to go ahead at the top right here, just define an account variable object, like so. And in here, I'm going to use the standard controller that's being passed in as an argument to define that. So we'll say this .account to reference this instance variable that's right here. And we are going to basically initialize it with whatever we get from the controller, or the standard controller. And the way we do that is by calling the standard controller that we got from the argument and then using the getRecord method for it. And that essentially will initialize this variable for us, which means we now have access to the account record that we're dealing with in our Visualforce page. Now, something to note, if we jump into our custom controller that we defined, I believe last time, you'll see here and that I talked about this get and set right here. And this is basically like a shorthand for defining a method that basically will for the get, it will return the account for you. And for the set, it will have some way of setting it for you. So basically just the getter and setter. If we use this syntax right here, we don't actually have to create those methods ourselves. But the interesting part is, in our controller extension, we don't actually have to define the getter and setter because our standard controller, which we are referencing here, already has those getter and setters for us. So we don't have to like redo that again, which I hope that makes sense to you. But yeah, the reason we had to do it in our just custom controller in the previous tutorial is because we were not leveraging the standard controller, which already has all that functionality built in for us. So we had to manually define it ourselves. But in this case, since we are leveraging a standard controller, that already has all the functionality. And so we can just kind of like piggyback off of that, if that makes sense. So anyways, that's why we're not putting a getter and setter right here. It's already defined for us in the standard controller. So once we have all of this, we can kind of go ahead and start working on our method. And I said that we'll create logic that basically will auto-populate some fields for us because we're lazy, and then we'll like add a button to that. So in this case, let's say that we want to create some very complex logic to auto-fill this account phone number for us at the click of a button, which doesn't sound that exciting, but you know, it's something. So we'll say public void because we're not going to return anything. And we'll say autofill phone number, I guess, to be more specific. So basically, anytime this thing gets called, all we're going to do is we're going to get our account, so this account, and then we're going to just set it to something. And I'm not sure if the account is a string. I know it's a phone, but I don't know if it expects a string, but I guess we'll find out in a bit. So if someone clicks on this future button of ours that calls this method, we are going to auto-populate that phone field, which I need to make sure I'm actually setting the phone field there. So we'll say 555, 555, 5555, which I think is the correct amount of digits. So essentially we've created custom logic that will change our account's phone field to this. And now we need to actually reference this logic in our Visualforce page. So like I said, we'll create a brand new command button in here. So command button, the value will be autofill. Actually, I don't know if autofill is one word, so I'm gonna just stay consistent like that. Autofill phone number, and then we'll have an action, and the action right here, that will just be the name of our method that we defined. So essentially this right here, autofill phone number, and then we'll paste it in here. And just by doing so, the way it's going to work is essentially the way the compiler would kind of do this is, you know, it's going to look for an autofill phone number method. It's going to see that it doesn't exist on a standard controller. So then it'll go into the extension and then it'll find it and then it'll run it essentially. So let's go ahead and hit save on that. And if we didn't make any mistakes, this should be easily deployable to our Trailhead org. So let's go ahead and try that. First, I'm going to go ahead and deploy the Apex class, which is our controller extension. So deploy source to org. And it looks like we got an error. So it says right here, illegal assignment from S object to account on line 14, I believe. So let's check it out, or line 6 rather. So it's saying this account equals standard controller get record. This issue is happening essentially because, so this standard controller get record method, it's returning just like a generic S object. So we just need to cast it to the appropriate type. So we can just say account in parentheses like this, and that should cast it properly, like so. So let's go ahead and save it one more time and deploy source to org and see if that works. As you can see here, it successfully deployed to org. So now let's go ahead and deploy our actual Visualforce page, which is the Visualforce controller extension page. Deploy source to org. And it ran successfully. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into our org and try this out and see if it actually works. So back in our org, I'm going to change the URL to traverse or go to that Visualforce page. So it was /apex /Visualforce custom. No, not custom. It was controller extension like this. And once it finishes loading, this is what it looks like. Here is our custom button. And essentially, this page allows us to create an account. So I'm going to give this an account. So we'll say test account number, we'll do 102 for today. The type, we'll set it to prospect, and the phone, I don't feel like filling it out. So let's go ahead and hit the autofill phone. And as you can see here, the phone number just kind of populated for us automatically because we did the autofill phone option. So let's go ahead and hit save and see if it actually works. So page finished refreshing. Let me go ahead and open up another tab and see if we have a test account number 102 in our system. And as we can see here in our accounts recently viewed, we have test account 102 with the phone number populated. So just to double check, let's go ahead and click into this. Let's go ahead and scroll down and you'll see here it was created by me at this time, which is technically correct. So yeah, it looks like it's working just fine. So yeah, I think that kind of basically sums up how controller extensions work. Now, obviously, this very simple example, I'm sure it's not very well thought out. There might be potential issues with the way the implementation has been designed. And by that, I mean, since I'm not actually doing like any checking of any kind and I didn't pass a ID here, I just kind of created one. I don't know if like if I save something, something will break. But I think you guys get the idea. So lastly, before I kind of wrap this up, I kind of want to go over one caveat to controller extensions. So in the beginning, I said that you can have multiple controller extensions, right? So, and now the problem can be what happens if you have two different controller extensions right here, but they have the exact same method name. So for example, actually, let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and create another page or another Apex class. I'll call this Visualforce Controller Extension 2. We'll hit save, just push it into the default directory. And I'll go ahead and just kind of copy this right here. Pretty much everything as is. I'll change the name so there's no problems. And we'll have the exact same method right here, but this one instead will change it to 111, 111, 1111, like that. And we'll hit save. Now what we'll do is we'll go into our Visualforce page and we will essentially reference both of them now. And the way you reference both is pretty sure you just include it with after. Don't forget to put the comma because that actually is necessary to kind of, distinguish one controller extension from the other. So now essentially what should happen, right? Like when this button is clicked, it's going to look for a method on either the standard controller, which it doesn't have, and then the extensions. Now you might think that it's going to use you may or may not think, rather I should say, that it's going to go into the last controller extension and use this method, since technically this you would think would be overriding this, but that's actually not how it works. Within Salesforce and controller extensions, the first one to have that method in the extensions, I should say, will run that method. So because Visualforce controller extension is the first one that contains this method right here, it will use this one right here. So if we go ahead and let's go ahead and deploy the second controller extension just to kind of show you guys that I'm not lying. So it looks like we got an error. Invalid constructor name, and that's because I forgot to change the constructor to the actual Apex page. So let me go ahead and do that, and we'll try to deploy source to org one more time. Once that's successful, let's go ahead and deploy our Visualforce page as well. And just to kind of show that I'm not crazy and this is how it works, right now what we are expecting is when we click on this button, it's still going to populate the phone number with a bunch of 5s. So let's go ahead and test that out. So I'll go ahead and give this a name, and let's go ahead and click on autofill phone number. And you'll see here that we still have a bunch of 5s. But now if we reverse the controller extensions, pretty much right here, let's go ahead and get rid of the comma, and we'll take the first controller extension and we'll put it after the second one. I'll hit save, and then I'll deploy this to our org. Once that is done, let's go ahead and run it one more time. I'll go ahead and hit refresh here. Let me go ahead and give this an account name. And now I will hit autofill phone number. And you'll see here that now we have a bunch of 1s. So essentially, like I said, when there is a method that is the same on multiple controller extensions, it's basically left to right. So the first one that has that method is the one that will run, regardless of any ones on the right. So yeah, pretty much that. I hope that makes sense. And like I said, and I always try to stress this, none of this is production grade code. Like I mentioned a bit earlier, I'm pretty sure this simple example might have some potential errors or bugs because we're not taking into account many things like no input validation and all that stuff. So yeah, I hope you guys have found this useful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.